What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking the 5 biggest mistakes people make in their fantasy football drafts and how to avoid them this 2024 fantasy football season. So make sure to tune in. If you enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us there. Let us hear it in the comment section. Do you agree, disagree, along with any other questions you guys might have? We'll do our best to answer them all. But with that being said, let's get right into it. And as you can see, I've got a simulated Fantasy Pros mock draft here through a couple of rounds. I figured that I would kind of utilize this as a good way to illustrate a lot of the points that we're going to be talking about and using specific examples here from what I would say is pretty realistic type of draft that you might see. So without further ado, again, let's talk about the 5 biggest draft mistakes you're going to see this 2024 fantasy football season, how to avoid them. I'm starting it off right at number 1. I think the biggest draft mistake most people will tell you is recency bias. So what does that mean for fantasy football? Well, basically, recency bias means you look at the year prior. Typically, it's a short-term approach, and you drafted a player that disappointed. Again, typically disappointed. It can be from the other perspective of did really well, and now you overdraft them, but typically disappointed. So you say, okay, well, I'm just going to avoid them now the year afterwards, and I'm going to let my feelings get in the way of what should be an analytical type of choice. And, this can happen at every single position, right? It can happen at the running back, wide receiver, quarterback, tight end position. Doesn't matter. No position is exempt from recency bias. Typically, you see it in the situation where, somebody was drafted very highly and then they disappointed. They didn't end up being a top 5 guy at their position. So now the individual that drafted them says, all right, well, sorry, but maybe a Bijan Robinson is now on my do not draft list for 2024 because he screwed me last year. Or, well, somebody like a Garrett Wilson, Aaron Rodgers got hurt. Garrett Wilson was absolute garbage. I'm not drafting Garrett Wilson now. Again, like a lot of times you got to dig through this situation, see why what happened ended up happening. But just to give you some concrete examples, like let's talk about Christian McCaffrey, right? Christian McCaffrey last year, he wasn't the first overall pick, whereas now he is yet again the unanimous number 1 selection. Last year, he was 3rd, 4th overall after, guys like Tyreek, Justin Jefferson. But what ended up happening? He ended up staying healthy the entire season, and he was by far and away the most useful fantasy football player in 2023. And now people are saying, okay, well, yeah, right, that should have always been the case. McCaffrey is, again, for sure the number 101 pick, and like, how could we have been so silly to forget that last year? We were screaming that McCaffrey should be the number 1 pick last year because when you look at the upside, when you look at projections, like you got to take the emotion out of it. When you look at projections, you project it for a full season without injuries, unless there's a pre-existing injury, right, type of situation. Another good example is somebody like a Keenan Allen. A couple years ago, Keenan Allen kept getting injured, right? Small things, couldn't play the majority of the season, would miss a handful of games, and he ended up being like really good value in the 3rd, 4th round in full PPR. And then like the last couple of years, he's been a top 10 wide receiver. Like those are the examples that we're talking about. If you let your emotion and the fact that you got hurt the year prior or the year before that get in the way, you're going to miss out on some really, really good values. And on the flip side, if you say, well, this guy carried me to a championship, like let's use Puka Nacua as an example, who set the rookie record for receiving yards, and now you're like, okay, well, he's going to automatically do it again in 2024 without acknowledging the fact that Cooper Kupp missed several games, that Cooper Kupp wasn't healthy for the majority of the season, then you can set yourself up for disappointment. So it works both ways, where you can overdraft somebody, or if you take somebody off your draft board completely, you're doing yourself a disservice. So by far and away, recency bias, I think, is the biggest mistake people make. How you can avoid it, I think it's simple. Again, try and take emotion out of it. Look at it from a big perspective. When you're doing data analysis, you look at a big range of data from several years. A lot of these players, you can go back a couple years and see how they've done. What is the expected type of production? Were there flukes, or like is what we've seen what you can expect from them? But let's move on to the number 2 point here, and I think this one also really important. It's going in to a draft with a set strategy. This can really backfire, specifically in snake formats. I'm not talking about auction drafts. That's a separate discussion, but it's snake formats when, where every round you go pick by pick by pick. Going in with a set strategy can be really, really detrimental to your roster construction. A lot of times you see this in those like zero running back or zero wide receiver draft strategies. We've tried to show you some of those pitfalls if you go into it with a set strategy. So maybe saying in the first 2 rounds, I'm going wide receiver, no matter what, or I'm going to running back, no matter what. Again, this can backfire because what you should be doing, how you should be avoiding this type of pitfall is, before the draft starts, thinking about, okay, well, the draft spot that I have, probably thinking about 2 different positions you can go with and several players you would be okay with, and just practicing best player available type of draft mentality. Because let's say, you're picking somewhere in the middle of the first round and you're dead set, I'm taking Breece Hall or Bijan Robinson. Typically, yes, I would say in 90% of situations, one of those guys will be available. But what if Breece and Bijan are 2nd, 3rd, 4th overall, something like that, and they're gone by the time you're picking 5th or 6th overall? Then what's probably going to end up happening is you're going to start panicking. That draft clock is going to start kind of going down faster and faster, second by second, and you might, end up having to reach on a player. Like maybe you say, okay, well, since Bijan and Breece aren't available, I'm going to take Saquon Barkley 4th overall or 5th overall. I think in that situation, you have to be comfortable with, again, going best overall player. If that's the case, then there's probably some really, really good values at wide receiver. So, again, going with a determined set strategy in a draft can really hurt you because that can also precipitate you reaching on a player. You don't want to do that either. Because, again, let's say in the first 3 rounds, using those zero running back, zero wide receiver draft strategies as examples, the first 3 rounds you've gone straight wide receiver. Well, the way your roster is constructed in the 4th round, you got to go with a running back, right? But what if the value isn't there? What if, all those guys have been selected, but there's guys like a Deebo Samuel, there's guys like a Nico Collins, for example. Like, on paper, you should be going with that, but the way your roster is constructed doesn't allow for it, so you have to reach. And oftentimes, that's how people come out of their drafts feeling very unhappy with the results of those selections. But again, let's continue to move on. Number 3 point here, and this is a big pet peeve of mine, drafting a quarterback early. Hell, I made an entire video of whether you should draft a quarterback early for the 2024 fantasy football season, and my answer in that video was a definitive hell no, you should not. Now, let's kind of look at it from the 2024 draft landscape. Your first overall quarterback is typically going somewhere at the end of the 2nd round. Typically, it is Josh Allen. Now, in this scenario, it's Patrick Mahomes at the 208, but it doesn't really matter too much. I've said this before. If you're dead set on selecting a tier 1 quarterback, at least, don't be the first one to pull the trigger on them, because there's 3 tier 1 quarterbacks right now: Mahomes, Allen, Jalen Hurts, regardless of how you want to rank them. But that 3rd guy is going to end up being the best value. And sure enough, this mock draft illustrates that. Like, Mahomes goes as the first guy being drafted. Then how many picks? Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 picks afterwards. Jalen Hurts goes a full round afterwards. I think that's much better value than selecting Mahomes or Josh Allen in the middle/end of the 2nd round. And then the other thing with the quarterback position, if you're dead set, on selecting quarterback in the 2nd and 3rd round, what are you have to be thinking about what you're also doing. Because that means you're probably passing up on a top 10 running back or on a top 10 wide receiver. And I think that's much more important, much more valuable to your roster construction than a quarterback at that point in time. Because look, people say this all the time, and I hate this this kind of defense of why you should select a quarterback early. They say if you land the quarterback one in your fantasy football draft, that increases your chances of winning your fantasy football league by so and so much percent. All right, cool. Guess what? Getting the number one running back, getting the number one wide receiver, getting the number one tight end, and landing those guys also increases your percent chance of winning your league by a crap ton, right? Like if you got Christian McCaffrey, I bet you there was a lot of teams that were in the playoffs or in the championships with Christian McCaffrey in their roster. Or let's say a Sam Laporta last year. And the point being is it's a lot easier to select a guy at the quarterback position that ends up being top 10 or even top 5, like in the later rounds. It's a lot harder to select a top 5 running back in round 8 or in round 9 of your fantasy football drafts compared to somebody like, let's just use the examples. Brock Purdy is still available. Jordan Love, guys that were top 5 guys last year for fantasy football scoring, but you got in the later rounds or probably off of waiver wires. So that's why the quarterback position, I hate it when I see a quarterback being drafted early on, like in the 2nd or 3rd round. Now, look, I get it. If like a Mahomes is there in the 4th or 5th round, it becomes a little bit of a different conversation. That's the case for every single player, even if I don't like them. At some point, the value is just too good to pass up. But we're talking about what happens the majority of times, and typically that is not the case. So again, this goes into understanding positional hierarchy. Like again, we could have a separate 40-minute discussion of why it makes more sense to not draft a quarterback early. What you should do instead is you have a lot of options at quarterback. You can stream the position first and foremost, or you can get a proven veteran guy that's likely going to be a top 10 finisher in the 8th or 9th round. Guys like Matthew Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, hell, Brock Purdy, right? Or even a Dak Prescott in the 7th round, a Joe Burrow in the 6th round, a Kyler Murray later on. So those are your examples. You can go with a high upside young quarterback like a Jaden Daniels, like a Caleb Williams, and then back him up with a veteran guy later on. So there's a lot of better ways, my point being, to approaching the quarterback drafting. Now, let's move on here with another point that I think is really important, and that's not using a tier system when it comes to drafting. Because if you're not using tiers, I think you can, again, this is for any type of draft, you can go to a point where all of a sudden there's a huge drop off in expected production, and you are kind of left there standing scratching your head. Well, how did this happen? How did I go from a guy that can be an RB1 to a middle of the pack RB2? Because that's a huge difference, and you got to understand where those tier breaks are. Like I think, for example, this year in the first round and a half, it's really easy to see that tier break. So let's use that as an example. I think after Puka Nacua and or Garrett Wilson, there's a huge tier break at the wide receiver position. So probably if you know that, well, okay, I should probably have it, if I want a top tier wide receiver, I got to get one at some point in the first round, or have a draft position where I can get a top tier running back and a top tier wide receiver if that is available to you and you can pick your draft spots. Same situation with the running backs. After a Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Jonathan Taylor, huge drop off at the running back position. There become a lot more question marks afterwards. Kyron Williams, what's going to happen with Blake Corum? Derrick Henry, he's more of a standard suited running back. He has to contend with Lamar Jackson. Achane, can he keep up the uber efficiency that he had last year? So a lot of question marks to those running backs. And so if you realize that right around here, like let's say after the 3rd or 4th pick in the 2nd round, there's a huge drop off in tiers for running backs and wide receivers, then if you instead went with a balanced approach of getting a top tier running back, top tier wide receiver here, your roster would be much better off because of that. So being able to identify those tier breaks, knowing when you go from a group of RB2s or wide receiver 2s to tight end 3s or to running back 3s, wide receiver 3s, that's really important. Knowing where the tight end break off is also really important. So like after Ingram, after Kyle Pitts, then you're like in Jake Ferguson land, because you can make the argument that guys like a Dalton Kincaid, guys like a Trey McBride, they can finish as the number one overall tight end. After those guys, when you're talking about Evan Ingram, Kyle Pitts, they can be really solid options, but they probably don't have top 5 upside. So again, being able to identify that really, really helps. So the best way to do that is kind of just before your draft, go into some set of draft rankings. Typically nowadays, they have those tier rankings included, and just realizing with overall player rankings where that comes out to, and circling a couple names and saying, all right, I feel comfortable with these and these players. So getting at least one of them puts you in a good position to continue on. And then let's talk about the last draft strategy that I think is really, really a potential mistake here, and that is not using the platform you are going to be drafting on come your actual draft day. So what do I mean by that? It sounds super simple, but trust me, like let's say you're drafting on Yahoo, that's where your home league is, but you're doing all these mock drafts on Fantasy Pros or on ESPN. Well, then you're going to become accustomed to some really different rankings, because we expose this every single mock draft that we do, in general breakdowns as well. Every single platform, folks, has rankings pretty different from one other, especially once you get like to the second and third round. Like, all right, in the first round you kind of know the names, but afterwards it becomes a little bit of a free-for-all. So basically the point being is, just because you can put together a roster that you really like on ESPN with, like, let's say the 6th overall pick, that doesn't mean you're going to be able to put together anywhere close to that same roster on Fantasy Pros, on Yahoo, on NFL, or again, wherever. So just do yourself a favor. This one's really, really easy. Common sense. Practice the majority of your drafting on your own platform, because, again, they're not all interchangeable. Just because you can put together a stellar roster with a certain pick on ESPN, on Yahoo, on NFL, it doesn't translate one to the other. So keep that in mind. But with that, we wrap up this breakdown of the 5 biggest draft mistakes that you have to avoid this 2024 fantasy football season. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully it was helpful. If it was, hit that like button, subscribe, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us there. Let us hear in the comment section, agree, disagree, along with any other questions you guys might have. We'll do our best to answer them all. But with that being said, we'll see you guys in future videos.